Come on in. We are so glad that you're here. Welcome to our April meeting of the Salt Lake City R user group. We are so glad that you're here. So I believe that as you're joining, you should be muted. Since there's kind of a lot of you, if you can try to stay muted for now, that would be really helpful. And we'll maybe just give a minute for folks to make their way in and then get started. Looks like we've got folks all joining. As we're getting started, I'll just do a few short announcements. We are so glad that you've joined us here at the Salt Lake City R user group. You probably found us via Meetup, which is where we do our organization. But I'll just drop a link in here for next month's meeting so that you can see that and find us again if you happen to find us a different way. So our meeting, our meeting next month is going to be about visualizing results for random forests. So that we're really looking forward to that. I think that will be a great topic. And the other thing that I want to highlight is that this is a friendly and professional space. We use the R Consortium's code of conduct here. So people like me and Andrew and Mark, who are the organizers of this group, will be moderating. We're really glad to have you, and we really appreciate you all bringing your considerate and respectful attitudes and selves here to our meetup. The only other announcement I think I'll give is that if you're someone who's interested in speaking, we would love to hear from you. So you can reach out to me or Andrew or Mark about speaking for our group. We love to hear from people about a new package that they've learned how to use, or how they've used R in their work or research. So we would love to hear from any of you who are part of our community if you're interested in sharing with us. I think that is all the announcements right now. And so I'm really excited about today's meeting. So today's meeting, our speaker today is Alicia Johnson. Alicia is a professor of statistics at Macalester in St. Paul. And as you'll see, Alicia's interests focus a lot on Bayesian statistics, data science education. And Alicia is one of the authors of a new book called Bayes Rules with an exclamation point. And it's a great resource for folks who are getting started with Bayesian analysis, Bayesian statistics. So we are really glad that Alicia is able to join us from Minnesota and hear more about that. So Alicia, if you are able to get started and share your screen, we would be really happy to hear from you.
Great. Can you see that and hear me?
Yes, that looks great. Okay. That looks great.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited. And like Julia said, I'm here to talk about, well, what I talk about today is going to be related to a book that I recently co-authored. And I've tried, but I think I can't pronounce it as well as Julia did with such enthusiasm. But yes, it's Bayes Rules, an introduction to applied Bayesian modeling. And it's really just hot off the presses. It just came out a few weeks ago in press, and it's also available for free online at bayesrulesbook.com. And I also want to acknowledge that everything I talk about today and everything in the book reflects a really true, great collaboration with my fantastic co-authors, Mina Dauchu and Miles Ott. If you don't know Miles and Mina, they're just two really fantastic, hilarious, kind people, which I'm especially thankful for because this collaboration was happening, in the middle of a pandemic. And also I'm grateful to them because we didn't know each other really before signing on to this multi-year project together. It just was the result of a few minutes chat at a conference. So I'm thankful that it turned out as it has. So what I want to do today is a couple of things. I'm not going to talk for that long. What I hope to do is I designed an activity to kind of get people started with Bayesian modeling, to get your hands dirty and play around with those Bayesian tools instead of listening to me tell you about them. But I also want to make sure that before we start playing around that we're on, some common ground. So my assumption is that some people here have done some Bayesian modeling before, and also that some people have never heard about Bayesian statistics. So that's how I want to start, is really just to get some context for how this Bayesian philosophy compares to the more commonly taught frequentist philosophy that you have probably encountered if you've taken an introductory course in statistics, for example. So to provide that context, I'm going to take a strategy from the first chapter of our book, which is to start with a quiz. And it's not a scary kind of academic quiz where you're going to be graded. It's more like a personality quiz that you might see in a magazine, like a quiz to help you determine if you're secretly a millennial, or to determine what Star Wars character you're like. So it's more of that kind of personality quiz. So just as in a personality quiz, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. So when I ask questions, instead of thinking about what you might have learned in a statistics class in the past, I want you to try to answer from the gut, or what your instinct says. The other thing is that there are no right or wrong answers here. Truly, there's no right or wrong answer. So it's just, again, thinking about what's my instinct here, what's my answer, without the pressure of you being right or wrong. All right. So there are 4 questions in the quiz. And again, these questions are designed to basically highlight the differences between the Bayesian and frequentist philosophies and introduce those kind of main concepts. And the first quiz question is trying to get at the ways that even something as fundamental as the concept of probability is different in frequentist and Bayesian analysis. So I'm trying to move things around on my screen. Pardon me for a minute here. Okay, here we go. All right. So with that, suppose that we have a coin and I tell you that the probability that we flip heads is 0.5. So what does this mean to you? All right, so here are the options. So first, A, if I flip this coin over and over and over, roughly 50% will be heads. Or does it mean to you that heads and tails are equally plausible? Or C, sorry, I'm going to minimize some things on my screen here. C, both A and B make sense. So again, think about in your head what you kind of relate to here, A, B, or C. And if you're willing to put your answer in an anonymous poll, we'll see how that works out. And I'll wait just a few seconds here.
Equally possible.
Pardon? All right. All right, so we have 68 responses. The majority were answer C. So I'll talk about answer C in a second. First, just for fun, I want everybody to, to look at the scores on the bottom and just tally your score on a, in your head or on a piece of paper. And a bigger score is not a better score, it's just a score. Right, so in this case, answer A corresponds to, let me close that, how a frequentist would interpret probability. So the frequentist philosophy is so named for the frequentist interpretation of probability. So mainly, probability is the long run relative frequency of an event. So if I have an event that I can repeat over and over and over and over in the long run, right, how many of those outcomes are heads, or what frequency are heads? So that's the way that frequentists would think about probability. In contrast, in the Bayesian philosophy, we don't think about probability as, kind of a long run relative frequency. Rather, it compares the relative plausibility of events. So in this case, the fact that the probability of heads is 0.5 or 50-50, it simply means heads and tails are equally plausible. And in this case, most people chose C, which is P for pragmatic. I think I agree. In this case, my instinct is that both of these interpretations make sense to me, both the frequentist and Bayesian interpretations. All right, so keep that in your mind. And in question 2, still related to probability, except we're going to change the context. So instead of talking about a coin flip, suppose that an election is coming up and you read that the probability that candidate A is going to win the race is 0.8. So what does that mean to you? So does it mean A, if we observe this election over and over and over and over, that candidate A will win roughly 80% of the time? Or B, B, candidate A is much more likely to win than to lose, specifically 4 times more likely? Or C, the pollster's calculation is simply wrong. So candidate A can either win or lose the election, thus their probability of winning can only be 1 or 0. So again, if you can lock that in your head and share it in the poll. I should also say I'm not good at monitoring the chat. So if you have something to say, I'm pro interruption. So feel free to speak.
Yeah, and you can also, if you want to type something into the chat, we as the moderators can also highlight it. So someone just was saying like, oh, plausible is an interesting word. Like, is plausible different from probable?
Yeah, good question. In terms of semantics, I mean, I guess probable is related to the definite, related to probability. So, I would be fine with probable. And then somebody might ask you, well, what do you mean by probable? And to that I might say plausible. But, in most contexts, I use them synonymously. It's a great question. All right, so to tally your score, again, higher score is not a better score, it's just a score. And in this case, most people answered item B. So A, again, in this case, corresponds to the frequentist interpretation. So if we look at just A, it's this idea of repeatability of an event. Now, in this case, A is a little bit awkward because elections happen. It's a one-time event, right? We can't actually repeat the election, right? We can't really repeat, all of the context of that election, right? What's happening in the world, what's happening in politics. We can't do that over and over. We can do it once. So a really strict frequentist interpretation might also be C, because we can't, repeat that event and it either happens or it doesn't happen, then the probability of candidate A winning is either 1 or 0. So A is a little bit awkward and C is pretty inflexible in my opinion. And B, the Bayesian interpretation of probability, right? Because it doesn't rely on this idea of repeatability of events. It has the flexibility to talk about probability or chance in these unrepeatable outcomes, right? And this is a lot of things in the world, right? What's a chance I get an A in a class, for example? I take the class one time. It's not repeatable, but I can start talking about the uncertainty of that event. And the Bayesian philosophy allows us to do that. All right, so questions 1 and 2, again, are highlighting the differences in this fundamental concept of probability. So the differences in the Bayesian and frequentist philosophy. Question 3, the goal here is to kind of understand the differences in kind of the bigger picture, or what are the pieces that go into a Bayesian analysis versus a frequentist analysis. So in this case, suppose that I tell you that I can predict the outcome of a coin flip, right? Which would be pretty spectacular, but it's also, based on my own experience of the world, seems like a pretty ridiculous claim. And then compare that claim to Mina, my co-author. Suppose she claims that she can distinguish between a Crown Burger burger, which I hear is a Salt Lake City thing, and she can distinguish between a burger there and a vegan alternative, which seems, you know, a lot more plausible to be able to distinguish between those two items. All right, so we have these two claims, and to test those two claims, we put me and Mina to the test 10 times, and we both succeed 10 out of 10 times. So I successfully predict the outcome of 10 coin flips, and Mina successfully distinguishes between a burger and vegan alternative 10 out of 10 times. All right, so same claims, or different claims, same data. So what would you conclude? So A, you're more confident still in Mina's claim than my claim, because my claim was ridiculous. Or B, the evidence supporting my claim is just as strong as the evidence supporting Mina's claim. So those are the only two options for this quiz. So think about where your instincts fall here. All right, wait another couple of seconds. All right. So as usual, tally your score here. And in this case, it turns out that item A is the Bayesian option, or how a Bayesian might think about these two claims, and B is how a frequentist might think about these claims. And I should also say, when I say Bayesian and frequentist, it's just you know, out of simplicity to remove some words from the sentence, or efficiency, I should say. So I, for example, do both Bayesian and frequentist statistics. So maybe I should say A is the Bayesian philosophy, B corresponds to the frequentist philosophy. All right, so I do want to talk about why that is. So again, in both of these claims, right, the data was the same. We had 10 out of 10 successes for my claim and Mina's claim. And so if you're thinking about how we do hypothesis testing in a frequentist statistics class, right, we look at the data, right? And so in this case, the data is the same. And so our conclusions are going to be the same, right? We have the same data. It's going to give us the same estimates, the same confidence intervals, the same p-values, the same, you know, technical conclusion. That doesn't mean that our kind of more nuanced contextual conclusions might vary a little bit, but the technical pieces are the same. So contrast this in the Bayesian philosophy. We start with the same data, but this data is also balanced with what was our prior understanding coming into these experiments. So in the case of my claim, our prior understanding based on all of our experience of the world is that that claim was ridiculous, and that Mina's claim, on the other hand, of being able to distinguish between, you know, a meat-based burger and a vegan alternative, that's a pretty reasonable claim. So in Mina's case, right, the data basically agreed with our prior understanding. And so then our conclusion, which combines both of those pieces and balances both of those insights, the conclusion is even stronger, right? We have strong evidence that, you know, our prior suggested that was a reasonable claim, the data backs that up. And so our posterior conclusion, if you will, is that, sure, we have strong evidence that Mina is, you know, brilliant at this distinction. But in my case, when we combine, or when we look at the data in light of our prior, because our prior understanding is so strong in this case that, you know, humans don't have ESP or can't make these kind of predictions, then looking at the data based on just a small sample of 10 results is not that convincing. So when I look at that data balanced against or in light of my prior, and I balance those two pieces of information, then my conclusion, my posterior conclusion is, you know, this is still pretty ridiculous. Maybe if we had looked at, 1,000 coin flips and I, predicted 1,000 correctly, it would be different. But in this case, with just 10 data points, our opinion just hasn't shifted that much. So those are.
There's a couple questions about this initial illustration here. That I think have to do with like how much the data moves the to get you to your your conclusion here, how much the data moves the prior, that that some people are asking about like would you call evidence stronger if it moved from your prior to your post more? So like would that, there are some questions about that. I hope that I expressed that about the same.
Great questions. Yeah, so there's a lot of nuance here that I'm not talking about. So in general, our Bayesian analyses balance our prior knowledge and the data. And the balance between them is not 50-50, or it just depends. So in some cases, my data is going to hold a lot more sway or influence over my posterior. Mainly if my data, I have a large sample size, or the trends I'm observing in my data are really strong, then that's going to start to outweigh my prior knowledge, no matter what that prior knowledge was. Right? There are other cases when my prior knowledge is going to take kind of precedent or have more sway than the data. Mainly if I have not much data and I have strong prior information. So say I'm looking at, information or the performance of a vaccine. And my prior knowledge about that vaccine is based on, a bunch of previous vaccines, other tests that we've run in the past. And then when so I have that strong prior information, and then, I might look at that vaccine and test it on, say, just 5 people, right? That's, not going to have as much sway. And so it's just kind of a balance between how much data do we have, how strong is our prior information, and where do those two kind of meet? Does that help?
Thanks for addressing that.
Yeah. But yeah, it's much more nuanced than I'm talking about here. And I'll say also then that means that, the more and more data we have, then our prior kind of fades away, and our Bayesian and frequentist conclusions, are going to be the same, or the overall vibe of those conclusions, if not the technical aspects of those.
You might be about to talk about this, but someone has asked, do we have to have a prior? Do we have to have previous experience or data or an opinion coming in?
Yeah, that's great. Great question. Also, so yeah, when I say the strength of prior knowledge, in some cases, we're walking into a situation where we have no prior knowledge, right? We're studying something new. We haven't, don't have a lot of context or prior information about it. And in that case, we can still have a prior model, but imagine it's just kind of flat, or just kind of this shoulder shrug, like the value of this quantity, whatever we're estimating, could be anything. It could be negative, it could be positive, it could be 0. We're not sure. So there is space in the Bayesian philosophy for those kind of like, I don't know kind of prior models.
Awesome. I think that sums up, I think, folks' current questions.
All right. Thank you. All right. And so the last question then, so the first 2 were about how do we think about even the fundamental concept of probability. This third question is more about what pieces go into our analyses. And the final question is, what kind of questions do we ask, right? So what kind of are the end conclusions that we make in frequentist versus Bayesian statistics? So in this case, suppose that you've tested positive for a very rare genetic trait, and that you only get to ask the doctor one question. Which question would it be? A, given that I got this positive test result, what's the probability that I actually have the trait? Versus B, if I don't have the trait, then what's the chance I would have tested positive anyway? So those are the two options. Think about it. Put your answer in the chat or the poll. All right, I'll wait a few more seconds. Okay, so a pretty strong majority in this case said option A. And so I'll ask that you again record your score. And it turns out that option A is the question that's asked in a Bayesian analysis. So in a Bayesian analysis, right, the known thing is our data, in this case, our positive test result. And we can ask then, based on this known information, what are the chances that my hypothesis is true? Or in this case, given that I got a positive test result data, what's the chance that I actually have the rare trait? Option B is the frequentist question. So what, kind of one of our final questions, or not final questions, but one of the questions that we ask in a frequentist analysis. And this question is equivalent to a p-value. So the p-value is asking, right, suppose that, the hypothesis is not true, then what's the chance that we saw this data? As somebody who teaches intro statistics a lot, and I'm teaching a few times this semester, I can tell you that this frequentist p-value is very hard to wrap our minds around, right? Because we have seen the data. So it's kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people to think of then asking about the uncertainty of that data, because we've seen it. Whereas in the case of a Bayesian question, we're asking about the uncertainty of our hypothesis. So something that we actually have uncertainty about, given the certainty of our data. Right. So in practice, the frequentist p-value is often, misinterpreted in this Bayesian way. And this is one place where I won't say there's a right or wrong answer, but I definitely think that A is a more natural question to ask. All right, so those are the fundamental differences in Bayesian frequentist philosophies. And just for fun, I'll ask that you count up your score and just kind of see on this spectrum from the Bayesian to frequentist philosophy where your current thinking is. And again, there's no right or wrong. Again, I'm not a Bayesian, I'm not a frequentist, I do both. But just thinking in terms of your instinct and gut reactions to these questions. Do they align more with the Bayesian philosophy or the frequentist philosophy? So I'll just give you a minute to think about that. And if you want to share in the chat, feel free.
As folks are thinking about that, there was a question back about like priors, like what is a prior? Someone said like, if I gather data, can I use like some data? Can I like say, okay, the data, this part of the data is what I'm going to use to generate a prior, and then I'm gonna apply that prior to the rest of my data. Like, is that something that is Bayesian to do? That makes me think of like empirical debates,
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say there are different philosophies to building a prior, and exactly what Julia said. So if you use your data to build your prior, then what you're doing is empirical Bayesian analysis. I would say that the arguments against doing that is that then you're kind of double counting the data in some way. You're letting it kind of drive your prior, and it's your data. And so that can have implications on how strong you think your conclusions are. But, there's room for all approaches, I would say. People definitely do that. But I think more commonly, people will build a prior based on, past experience with the context at hand. And now I'm reading the chat, so I can do this now. So do we have a Bayesian equivalent to the p-value? And I mean, I guess in my mind, this is kind of not the equivalent, it's a different question, but it's the equivalent to what's asked. And then let's see, so in a previous discipline, we would use effect sizes from meta-analyses to inform our priors. Yeah, that's great. That's a great example. All right. All right, so that was the end of me talking. Again, I just wanted to get on a common ground in terms of what is Bayesian statistics versus frequentist statistics. And yes, another great question in the chat, is there something like confidence intervals? Absolutely. And I think in the activity I prepared, you'll see some examples. But like this difference between a frequentist p-value and this Bayesian probability, there's also a difference in how we interpret a Bayesian versus a frequentist interval. So in a frequentist interval, we're asking basically about the uncertainty in our sampling process. So what's the chance that we got a sample that, you know, covers or that produces an interval that covers what we're trying to estimate? And in the Bayesian philosophy, again, it's a little bit more natural to me because it asks, what's the chance that the thing we're trying to estimate is in our interval? So it's a question about the uncertainty of the population, not the uncertainty of the sampling process. All right. Okay, and I'm happy to stay and answer questions, but I did again prepare an activity. I started this in a previous meeting or workshop, and then just made some small updates for today, but you can find it at my GitHub page. So it's just our markdown document. I definitely recommend working on the desktop version of our RStudio, or I guess RStudio, since it's so basically the Bayesian modeling and visualization packages needed for the activity are less buggy on the desktop version. That said, I also put together a project on rstudio.cloud. If you want to try it there, it might be a little slow, a little buggy, but it also means that you wouldn't have to install packages on your own. So this activity is definitely too long to finish in the time remaining, but I just wanted to give you something to play around with in case you want to chip away at things now or work on it later. And it has separate stages that you can kind of pick and choose kind of based on your previous experience with Bayesian analysis, where you might want to start. So if you're completely new to Bayesian statistics, there are some exercises at the beginning that get into more of the details of the concepts I've talked about so far. So kind of what does a prior look like? How does it balance with our data? How do these combine to give us a posterior model? And then later, if you are someone who's more familiar with Bayesian statistics, you might skip those first exercises and jump down to somewhere you get into more kind of modeling pieces. So that's the idea. And Julia, I don't know if you have ideas for the best way if we want to make random breakout rooms or.
Let's see. I don't think we kind of, I think, have too many people to have one of us with all the breakout rooms.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe in this context, we might maybe choose not to do that. But would you want to walk through maybe one of the let's see, what should we do to do interactive? Do you want to do you want to walk through maybe the beginning of the more intro ones, and then folks can have freedom to like look at the later ones?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll do that. Let's see. All right, I'll get that loaded. All right, let's see. All right, so you can ignore the other things on my screen here. It's for class. So if I just scroll down a little bit in this document, so the getting started section, again, the goal here of all these exercises is to start thinking like Bayesians, or what does that mean? Or I should say, think in the Bayesian philosophy. And then eventually, if you get to this point, how can we apply this Bayesian thinking in a regression setting? And again, you do you all the time. So depending on your previous experience, if you're newer, you might listen to me at this point. If you have some experience, maybe you'll put me on mute and play around on your own. It's up to you. I'm fine with whatever you do. So there are just some packages to get started. So I'm going to load those. And again, if you don't have those loaded right now, that's fine. You can just watch along as I work through these first exercises. The few in the middle here, the 4 in the middle, are Bayes specific. So the tidyverse and broom.mix packages are more universal. All right, so part 1 is starting to think like a Bayesian. And we're going to use functions from the package that we built or wrote for our book, and use this package to familiarize ourselves with the main components of a Bayesian model. So what a prior model is, the data, and the posterior. We're going to do that in the context of what we call a beta binomial model. There are some technical details about what that is, and I'm going to skip those details, but you can see it in the book if you get curious. All right, so the context of these exercises, or the first exercises at least, is that we want to focus on pi, where pi is the proportion of US adults that believe that climate change is real and caused by people. So pi is a proportion, and so it's some value between 0 and 1. All right. Also important here is understanding that we don't know what pi is, right? We haven't asked everybody in the world about their opinion of climate change. And so our goal is, again, to use data and our prior knowledge to build a model or understand pi. So the first step here is, before or prior to collecting any data, we want to make a prior model for pi. And again, there are a lot of details that I'm going to skip over in terms of what can inform a prior model. And we're just going to play around with, what do these prior models look like and how do we interpret them? So in this case, suppose we have a friend that specifies their understanding of pi, the proportion of people that believe in climate change, and they say that their model for pi is beta 220. So if you've taken probability, you might be familiar with the beta model. If not, it's fine. It's mainly just a mathematical representation, and we'll focus more on what that looks like.
That what you just said highlights maybe like a question that was asked just to above on the chat. Like, can people just start out data analysis from a Bayesian perspective? Like, can it be like a beginner intro to stats, to be like, hey, let me tell you how stats works. You've got you know something already. It's a prior. You measure your data. Like what do you think about that?
Oh, I feel like this is a controversial question that I very much enjoy, because there are some people, I think there are some intro stat books, like, think of a regular intro first course in statistics class that are written from the Bayesian perspective. I'll give you my opinion, and this is not at all a consensus opinion, or I don't know. Maybe because I just haven't seen it much, it's hard for me to picture this, other than if we kind of started and spent most of the semester kind of having a flat prior kind of running in the background. So you're kind of ignoring prior information, but it's still a technical piece of your model. I can see doing that, and then maybe toward the end of that first course, then start talking about, well, we can change up what our prior model is. I know that's not a very
No. Actually, that
complicated.
leads into something someone else asked. Before you maybe start, we look at the beta distribution.
Yeah.
Someone said like they have heard maybe that like a frequentist interpretation or frequentist statistics is a special case of Bayesian statistics with just a uniform prior. So what is your perspective on thinking about frequentist and Bayesian in that way, Bayesian stats in that way?
That's a great question too. I mean, I guess I can see why somebody would say that, but it remains to be the case that the questions that we can answer with the Bayesian analysis are still different, even if our prior model is flat. Say things like our best guess of, say, a model coefficient or population mean, those best guesses would be the same basically for a Bayesian and frequentist analysis if we start with essentially no prior. But still the questions that we can ask are different. So, and again, this kind of distinction between a p-value and the Bayesian counterpart to that.
Awesome. Well, so this next question is about moving forward. Someone is like, what is this beta model? I don't understand. Like, what is this?
Okay, so let's look at the beta model. So the plot beta function provides some insight into what the beta model is. So I'm just gonna run that chunk and show you a picture of the beta model because it'll be easier to discuss. So in our analysis here, our quantity of interest pi is a proportion between 0 and 1. And so in probability, we have different models that apply in different settings. So you might be familiar with a normal model that's, bell-shaped. Technically, it runs the gamut from negative infinity to positive infinity. And so a normal model isn't necessarily appropriate in this case because the proportion is between 0 and 1. It's not on the real line. And also the normal model is always bell-shaped and symmetric. So in this case, if I want to kind of model my understanding or the uncertainty about pi, then a beta model is a good option because a beta model, I'm not going to get into the mathematical details, but essentially it's a model that lives on 0 to 1, just like pi does. And it's really flexible. So we can make it right skewed, left skewed, symmetric, flat, bimodal. It can take on all sorts of shapes. And so it has the flexibility for us to kind of tweak it to really reflect our prior understanding. So in this case, right, the beta 220, again, we can play with these two parameters, 2 and 20, but in this specific case, the beta model is right skewed, right? And it's, well, I don't want to say more about it. I actually want to ask, based on this model, if you were just to kind of take a leap and guess how we would interpret a model like this, based on this model, what do you think your friend is saying about what they think is the most likely value of pi? And I'll read the chat. 2 out of 22, 0.12, 0.18. Yeah, like those are all good guesses. So what I mean here, what do they think is the most likely value of pi is like, what is their best guess or what do they think it's around? And these answers, 2 out of 22, 0.12, 0.18 are all, relatively close to another. So if I look at kind of where's the spike of my prior model, you can kind of think of that as, this is my best guess, right? And that is around, 0.12-ish, a little bit lower maybe, right? But it's essentially saying that your friend, because the prior model is most focused at this area that's a little bit below 0.12, that's kind of where they think pi is. Or if I translate it to the context, they think that maybe around 10-12% of people believe in climate change. And then that's just, one kind of guess. What do I think is typical, right? But then the other role of a prior model is to reflect how certain or uncertain we are about that, right? So in this case, if we look at the range, the prior model drops off a little bit above 25%, right? The model goes to 0. And that basically says your friend does not think it's very likely that pi is 0.25 or above. Or they're pretty confident, in other words, that under 25% of people believe in climate change. Right, so again, the prior reflects kind of what do we think is the most plausible value for pi and our uncertainty in that. So kind of what's a range. So here I would say our friend is pretty certain, right? Pi could be anywhere from 0 to 1, technically, but their kind of understanding of pi is pretty squished or specific and focused on these lower values, closer to 0. Any questions about that before moving on? Okay, so we'll go on to the next piece, which is to check out some data. So the second step in a Bayesian analysis after we've built our prior model is to collect data. So suppose your friend surveys 10 people, and of those 10, 6 believe that climate change is real and caused by people. So how we translate that data into information for a Bayesian model is just like we do in a frequentist model, and that's through the likelihood function. So I'm going to plot the likelihood function and then talk about it. So we can plot that likelihood function with the plot binomial likelihood. And we get the picture here. Right, so again, notice that the x-axis, it focuses on pi values, and those pi values have to live between 0 and 1. Right? And so what this likelihood function is plotting is, what's the chance that we could have gotten these 6 out of 10 survey results under different possible pi values? So before talking more about it, I'll give people a chance to take a crack at this question. So if we're just focusing on, again, on the data, not our prior, with what values of pi are the 6 out of 10 data results most consistent? A 0.6? Yeah, exactly. So if you think of a frequentist analysis, or we're just looking at the data, right? 6 out of 10 or a 60% outcome in our data, based on that alone, our best guess of what's happening in the population is that there's also 60% of people that believe in climate change, right? So that idea that 6 out of 10 or 0.6 is our best guess is illustrated here by our likelihood function spiking at that value. So the likelihood of seeing that data is the biggest if pi were also 0.6. But again, that's just kind of our best guess based on the data. Another role of the likelihood function is to give us kind of some sense of uncertainty of those outcomes. So if I think about this question and I look at my likelihood function, right, it looks like, well, these 6 out of 10 results would be the most likely if pi were 0.6. It's still pretty likely if pi were, say, between, for simplicity, between 0.5 and 0.75. So in this range, the likelihood is still high, meaning that suppose only 50% of people in the population believed in climate change, then these results, this 6 out of 10, still, fairly common. But the fact that the likelihood function drops off to 0 down here and up here is basically saying that our data would not be very likely to happen if, pi were as low as, say, 0.1. So if only 10% of people in the population believed in climate change, the chance of getting 6 out of 10 in our survey data would be very unlikely. right? So to kind of bring those two pieces together, the prior ignores the data and it's just looking at, what's our best guess of pi and what's our uncertainty about pi before seeing any data. The likelihood function is ignoring the prior and just looking at the data and basically asking with what values of pi are the data consistent. And so if we were doing a frequentist analysis, we'd really just use this likelihood function. But in a Bayesian analysis, right, we combine those two pieces. Both are important. And so to build a posterior model of pi, we combine the prior model with the data as represented by the likelihood function. So again, I'm just going to run this chunk to get a sense of how those three pieces play together. There we go. I'll go back to my questions about these. So if we compare your friend's prior understanding of the proportion of people that believe in climate change, and then we balance that prior with the data as represented by this scaled, I should say, likelihood function, the posterior is a balance of those two pieces, right? So you can see that it's somewhere in the middle, right? It's not as low. They don't think it's as low as they thought before seeing the data, because the data kind of convinced them that that proportion is higher. But it's also not as high as 60% as suggested in the data, because that 6 out of 10 result is fairly small, not based on a big sample size, and the posterior is a little bit lower than that. Right, so in this case, right, their prior or their posterior understanding is more around, right, their best guess is more around, say, 0.25-ish. So a quarter of people believe in climate change, whereas their prior assumption was that it was closer to 10%. And the range of their posterior certainty or uncertainty, right, they're still pretty uncertain. In this case, we can see that they don't think that more than 50% of people believe in climate change, but that value is somewhere between, say, I don't know, 0.05 and 0.5-ish, right? So again, the main thing here is just that this posterior is balancing these two pieces, right? What did your friend think before? What did the data say? And how do those, what do those pieces tell them together? So that's the main, again, the main idea of the pieces that go into a Bayesian analysis. And again, this balance between the prior and the data depends on a lot of factors. So how much data do we have? How strong is the prior model? And so the next exercises get more into that kind of balance and how that balance shifts. And so let's see. Exercise 4, maybe we can do one more together, or maybe 2 more. But yeah, in exercise 4, it says, consider another friend that they had the same polling data, but they started out with a different prior. So before seeing that data, their prior looked like this. So this is another example of a beta model. In this case, the parameters that are defining this model are 1 and 1 instead of 2 and 20, I think. And in this case, that tuning of the prior model is flat. So this is what I was talking about earlier, that this is basically a shoulder shrug, right? This friend saying, I really don't know anything about people's opinion of climate change. The proportion that believe it's real, that could be anywhere between 0 and 1, and any outcome in there is equally likely. Right? So this is a very uncertain prior model. So when we take this very uncertain prior model and we balance it out with the data, right? In this case, a different prior is going to lead to a different posterior, right? So it's just like if we changed up our data, our posterior would change. Same thing here, if we change up our prior, our posterior is going to change. So in this case, if we were just to anticipate, what do we think the new posterior would look like? and how it would compare with the data, instead of asking a big open question, like, what do you think it'll look like? I'll just ask, do you think that the posterior for the second friend is going to be more or less similar to what we saw with the data than what it was for the first friend? So do you think that they're going to be more swayed by the data or less swayed by the data? Yeah, more similar to the data. Yeah, so let's see how it works out. Turns out that that intuition is correct. So I'm just, let's see. I'm going to copy this chunk and put it down here. Right, so if I just change my parameters of my prior model and I keep the data the same, and I look at how they play together. In this case, because the prior was basically nothing and said, I don't have an opinion, then in that case, the posterior essentially perfectly aligns with what the data said. So this is kind of that, getting to that question that somebody asked about, well, if we don't really have a prior, then will the Bayesian and frequentist results be similar? And the answer is yes, right? Our frequentist guess in this case would be that 60% of people believe in climate change. Our best guess from a Bayesian posterior analysis would agree that our best guess is that 60% believe in climate change. But, and I don't have time to go into the nuances, if we were then to go on and do things like create intervals or credible intervals in Bayesian analysis for that proportion, or if we were going to start testing hypotheses about pi, how we would interpret those and execute those would be different, fundamentally different in Bayesian versus frequentist settings. The last thing, and I'll just kind of not pause for a question here, but just the prior, again, is only one piece of the posterior puzzle. So in this case, suppose we increase our sample size from 10 to 1,000 people. So I have some data here that shows among 1,000 people, 655 believe that climate change is real and caused by people. And in this case, again, I'm just gonna, let's see, in the interest of time and you having, your lunch break is almost over. I'll just plug it in myself down here. So what did I say? 655 out of 1,000. So if we change that data, or if we even go back to our original friend, right? So our original friends prior that thought, the probability that somebody believes in climate change is low. But in this case, our data is, we have so much data, right? That in this case, our likelihood is really narrow. So the range of pi values for which we could have seen this outcome in this amount of data is much more narrow than when we only had a sample of size 10. So in this case, even though that original friend wasn't very swayed by a poll of 10 people, they're very much swayed by a poll of 1,000. Right? So again, this posterior is always this push and pull between the prior and the data. So it is 2 or 1 your time. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm happy to stay and chat, but I also want to give people a chance to graciously pop out of the meeting.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much, Alicia, and thank you all so much for coming. We can stick around a little bit to answer a few questions, but we thank you so much for coming and hope that you will join us another time for another topic. So one question that was a little more advanced that was asked earlier was about, given your experience teaching Bayesian statistics and writing this book, when people talk about like using something as a replacement for a p-value, like something like you hear about like the Bayesian like posterior odds ratios or something, it's like I need something that's like tells me whether this is significant or not, or like something with a cutoff. What is your perspective on that, like given your experience teaching and writing the book?
Yeah, it is challenging. I mean, I'm teaching the p-value right now and confidence intervals. And uncertainty is hard, and making yes and no conclusions is much more comfortable, I think, for people. But I feel like, both frequentist and Bayesian, communities or people that do both, I feel like it's more moving into, like, personal opinion, a more appropriately nuanced kind of place that, I think most people agree that 0.05 is not some like magic number for a p-value. And similarly, when we're looking at Bayesian posterior probabilities, there's also no magic number for a cutoff. And I actually think that's a more powerful thing, like to be able to actually, here's my measure of uncertainty of this hypothesis, is much more powerful than making a yes/no conclusion.
Yeah. That's a great perspective. I think one other question that got asked earlier is how, if I'm working on like a real data analysis project, how do I, actually someone just typed up again, this is very similar. Like how do you actually parameterize your prior? Like what do you need to know about how to do that? Like, about the beta binomial or the, like a beta model, like how do you, how do you go about parameterizing your prior knowledge?
Yeah, there's like, I feel like most of my answers are very vague. But I think like most things in statistics, there's not like a cookbook. And that's, I think still, as somebody who's been doing this for 25 years, it's still pretty intimidating. But it just depends. So I'm working right now with a doctor friend on a Bayesian analysis, and he is, going back and looking at previous studies, looking at the effect sizes observed in those studies. And those studies aren't exactly the same as what he's looking at, but they're very kind of similar in the components. And so we're kind of going through the process right now of asking those questions of kind of what's the range of things that have been seen in previous studies? How much additional uncertainty do you need to add to those observations, given that this is, a slightly new setting? And so it's a lot of playing around before looking at the data, or kind of a lot of, try it out and see, like, if I tune it this way, does that actually reflect? But if I take something more simple and just think, okay, say we have an election coming up and I want to do a Bayesian analysis of a new poll result, then my prior model for the support for candidate might be based on, well, what's the range of their polling support in past polls, right? And can I tune a prior model that kind of, peaks at what was kind of the most common or most recent polling result, and does my prior reflect the range in the recent results that we've seen?
Yeah. If you were to maybe sum that up, like, what do you think are, so you said, I noticed you say, like, you choose this before you look at your data. And you use the word tune. What, like, if you were to sum up, like, just once more, maybe like caveats, or like, like how to approach choosing priors. Is there anything else you would add there?
I mean, I'm happy for anybody to add their opinions, because this is like, but I guess one of my opinions is that I always err on the more uncertain side of things, like I always, even if I feel like I'm pretty sure about something, I still put in more uncertainty as kind of a buffer. And then I kind of go for it, because I just feel like if I'm working in a small sample setting, like I'll spend a lot more time maybe than if I'm working in a larger sample.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Okay, so if anyone else, so we're past the hour, so thank you all if you have to head out. But does anybody else have like another question they want to type, or you can use the little raise hand feature, or any final questions here? All right. Well, thank you again so much, Alicia. I think this is the first time we've had like a really interactive kind of talk. So we really appreciate you coming and doing that. And I think it's so fantastic. People had People had really great responses here, and we're like happy to do something interactive like this on their lunch break or at whatever time zone you happen to be. So I think we will wrap up the recording. We will thank you all so